What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Wanted to remind you before the start of this video that this is the Wednesday True Scary Story Megamix. As a reminder, I will still do Wednesdays, Fridays, and sometimes Mondays for the Megamix, but they will be 1 hour and 30 minutes instead of 2 hours to make sure that the quality is up to snuff. If you guys are enjoying these long compilations of new scary stories, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing any of these, let alone all of them, really helps the video to do well and ensures the channel does well as well. It helps to make sure that I can continue making daily videos and these longer videos for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories used in this video, please feel free to leave them in the comments below, as I always enjoy reading your guys' comments and take them into account, even if I can't always respond to them. Without further ado though guys, I will let you enjoy the next hour and 30 minutes of True Scary Stories, and I'll see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching and have a great day. When I was pregnant with my first child, I worked the overnight shift at a gas station near my house to pick up some extra hours. I know this may not sound amazing, but this gas station was beautiful. It was one of those full market gas stations and in a really nice section of town. I know most stories that take place in these sorts of 24-hour settings are usually in dark and eerie places, but I never once felt that way about this location. Usually after 11 o'clock at night, it was slow. I would spend most of my shift watching YouTube or Netflix on my phone, talking to my fiance or stocking all the shelves. There weren't even all that many overnight truck drivers buying coffee or snacks or anything. The gas station wasn't that close to any nearby highways. It was an easy job, especially being pregnant, and it paid quite well, which was the main reason I had this job. One night early in my shift, a taller man came in. I called out from behind the counter, "Hey there, how you doing this evening?" The man didn't respond, didn't even look in my direction. He just walked straight into the bathroom. That wasn't alarming to me though. If I'm being honest, I knew better than most at this point that you kinda gotta go when you gotta go. I just figured he really had to go badly to the bathroom. After nearly 20 minutes had passed though, I realized they had never come out. I was a little bit concerned and was thinking about knocking on the door to make sure he was alright. I slowly started making my way to the bathroom and saw he had finally come out. I got a good look at his face at this point. He was normal looking as could be, clean shaven with a tan complexion. He had short gray hair that was parted and combed nicely. Even though his hair was gray, he couldn't have been older than 40 years old. He was wearing jeans, a flannel, and work boots that looked really beat up. I got the impression this guy must be some kind of blue-collar worker and was just stopping in to use the restroom. He walked right by me again and didn't say a single word. He walked outside, but didn't get into any vehicle. He looked like he walked to the side of the building. That's when I noticed there were no vehicles out there whatsoever. Whoever this strange man was, he must have walked the entire way here. That ordeal was a little bit off-putting, but overall I stopped thinking about it just a couple of minutes later. It was an uneventful part of working these late-night shifts. You get your array of strange individuals, and usually nothing ever comes of it. As the night continued, I ended up calling my fiance. We were talking on the phone, passing the time. It had to be at least an hour later. The door opened, and to my surprise, it was the same guy. I didn't say anything to him, figuring that maybe he spoke another language or something. Well, that theory went out the window instantly, because instead of walking to the bathroom this time, he walked right up to the counter and asked me in a very polite voice, "Hello, ma'am. You can say hello to me now." He smiled as he said it, indicating to me that he was joking around. I nervously smiled. "Sorry about that, sir. Hello, how are you doing this evening?" He smiled and only responded with one word, in an abrupt tone. Jerky. I jumped back a little bit and said, "Excuse me?" The man then leaned in toward me, and his polite voice changed into a more aggressive tone. "I want beef jerky. Where is it?" I pointed over to the rack where all the jerky and Slim Jims were located. He smiled at me, and now in a polite tone once again, he said, "I thank you, ma'am." He slowly walked over to the beef jerky and stopped once he got to the rack. He was standing completely still when he said to me, "You know, you look just like a Disney princess." I was a bit creeped out, but said thank you anyway, figuring he was just trying to be nice. I look like a lot of things, sure, but one thing I definitely do not look like is a Disney princess, trust me. Without grabbing any of the jerky, he marched back over to the counter and started to stare at me. I know staring on its own is harmless, but this stare was so intrusive and made me incredibly uncomfortable. His eyes were flying around like ping pong balls. Yeah, that's it, Disney princess. See it now? I gave a little half smirk, but apparently that wasn't good enough for this man. He started to shout, and I mean quite literally starting to scream. "What, you don't like Disney?" I didn't even have time to respond before he started to shout again. "My daughter used to like Disney, and now she's just like you." I started to gather that clearly this man was not right in the head. I had no idea what that statement was even supposed to mean. His daughter is just like me? As calmly as I could, I said, "I'm sorry if I offended you." He cut me off and started to scream uncontrollably. At this point, he wasn't even saying anything that made any sense at all. It was just a lot of gibberish and nonsense. Saying things like, "Instead of princess, you all want to be heroes," and even more strangely, "I could be a king, and instead I'm here." It was clear to me that this man was having some sort of breakdown. Thankfully, I'd never hung up on the phone with my fiancé, who was witnessing this entire unhinged conversation. He felt like something was clearly not right, and he didn't want to take any chances. He called the police and told them I was dealing with an unhinged, unruly, and potentially hostile customer. Well, I've never been more thankful for my fiancé, because during the man's rant, he did indeed start becoming hostile. He stormed back over to the beef jerky and knocked over the entire display. Even though this guy was clearly not right, this was the first moment I actually felt physically unsafe. After knocking over the display, he turned and looked at me. His eyes were almost indescribable. They looked void of any emotion. In that moment, 2 cop cars pulled up, but the man didn't even flinch. He just stood over by the rack and continued to stare at me. The cops walked inside, and to their credit, they didn't overreact at all. They remained very cool. One of the officers came to me and made sure I was all right, which I was. The other officer went over to the man and was talking to him quietly. I couldn't make out any of the words the cop was saying to him, but the man looked very upset. He didn't lose his temper as he did moments ago, though. The officers escorted him out, not in handcuffs or anything. Literally just walked him outside and had a conversation. It lasted a good 20 minutes or so. One officer left with the man, with the other hanging around at the gas station with me, making sure the man did not attempt to come back. I have no idea what would have happened if my fiancé wasn't still on the phone and called the police. The man was becoming more and more enraged with every moment that passed by. I never saw the guy again, and I never placed any official report really after this night. I didn't work another overnight shift. I know some people may have had far worse and more terrifying stories of working overnight. I truly do feel for those people. However, this was the worst thing that ever happened to me personally, and even though I was left with no physical harm, the fear I felt that evening, looking into the eyes of this crazed man, is something that will always be burned into my brain. Anybody who's ever worked at a fast food restaurant overnight knows just how unique some patrons can be. To add another variable to this already great combination, I worked at a 24-hour McDonald's that was directly off an exit. It was a frequent stop for truckers, cops, drunks, and anybody looking to get hot food in the middle of the night. As you would expect, I met countless characters I could describe. I could write a book about every strange and unique human being I met while working at that job. I've even had some wild experiences with people who decided to have an all-out brawl right in the middle of the restaurant. But none of those experiences were as scary or crazy to witness as this one. I guess only once in the 2 years I worked at that restaurant did I really experience something that horrified me. It started like most nights that I did the overnight shift. I got there at 10 and it was extremely slow. It was always really slow at that time. Then you would get a rush from about 11:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m. Then, depending on the day, it would be very sporadic throughout the night. On this night, I was hoping for a slower night. It was just one of those days where I was not really feeling it at all. My car wouldn't start in the morning. My husband tried to figure it out, but unfortunately cars aren't his strong suit, so therefore I was left without a vehicle. On top of that, I felt under the weather. It happens to me every fall season. I felt like a house was crushing down on me. I just wanted to climb under a blanket and pass out, but unfortunately, I got bills to pay. Unless I was extremely sick, calling in was not really an option. Thankfully, I was able to take my husband's Silverado truck to work. A little after 2 a.m., my coworker and I were just hanging out. I ended up getting my wish with it being slow that night. It was one of the slowest nights I could ever remember working. My coworker went into the office to do some paperwork. I think that was really an excuse to go take a nap or something though. I didn't have the energy to call him out on it. When I was alone at the counter, listening to YouTube on my phone, I heard the bell for the door ring. It was a peculiar-looking man walking inside. He wasn't an old man, but he wasn't exactly young either. Maybe mid-40s if I had to guess. He looked homeless, but not grungy or dirty. More like he was just not put together right. He was shorter than me, but I'm fairly tall for a woman. He couldn't have weighed more than 130 pounds. As he slowly approached the counter, I called out to him, "Hey there, sir, what can I get you tonight?" He just looked at me and smiled. I wish I could have a picture of that moment. The look he was giving me as he smiled made me so unsettled. Something about the way he was looking at me was just not right. It gave me the creeps before he even spoke. His eyes were so dark they almost looked black, and his mouth was just open enough with his smile that I could see his yellow teeth. Finally, he spoke after what seemed like an outrageous amount of time. I was surprised at the deep southern voice that came out of this little man. "Wow, aren't you gorgeous? I thought I wanted fries, but maybe I'll order something else." Yeah, I know, that's weird and creepy, but working this graveyard shift at a restaurant that gets a lot of customers who are under the influence, I'm used to weird attempts at flirting. I just smiled and said very politely, "Okay, sir, well, when you know what you want, just let me know now." The man grinned from ear to ear, flashing his full set of yellow and gray teeth. He slapped his hands down on the counter, and all I could see were his long, dirty fingernails. I tried not to look visibly disgusted. He spoke up again. "Forget the fries. What time are you done?" Usually, something like this, I would just smile and say I'm married and move on with my life. I don't know if it was because I didn't feel good, or maybe because this guy gave me the creeps from the start. Instead, in an annoyed and aggressive voice, I responded with, "If you don't want to order any food, you can leave right now." The man just started to laugh, as if I'd just told him a real great joke. Before I said or did something I would come to regret, I turned around and started knocking on the office door. When my coworker opened the door, he could tell I was visibly shaken. I told him about this creepy guy, who was clearly in sight. He smirked because he knew right away what I was dealing with. He told me to go take a break and that he would take care of this guy. Without even thinking or looking back, I grabbed my coat and went outside and sat in my husband's truck for 15 minutes. I just listened to some music. I'd almost forgotten about that creep, up until right before I went back inside. I noticed him wandering on the far side of the parking lot with a to-go bag in his hands. I was relieved my coworker was able to get rid of him peacefully. I decided to wait in the truck for another 5 minutes just in case. I didn't want this creep to know which vehicle was mine. When I finally went back inside, my coworker looked more than a little bit freaked out. I asked him about his interaction with that freak, and his answer freaked me out even more. He said in a tentative voice, "I don't know if I should tell you." I started to jokingly hit his arm, and I told him to tell me what happened, to which he complied. He said the guy was absolutely crazy. When I came out to take his order, he just kept asking where the girl was, so I told him you went home for the night. He started losing his mind, screaming and swearing. I ended up just giving him a free medium fries just to shut him up and get him out of here. Then he turned around as he was walking out and said, "Tell Monica I said goodbye, and I'll see her soon." This little story almost made me faint, mainly because I don't even wear a name tag at this job. I have no earthly idea how this man could possibly know my name. For the remainder of the shift, I couldn't focus. I just kept looking over at the door, expecting this man to stumble back in, but thankfully he never did. Close to 4:30 in the morning, I asked if I could leave early. He knew I wasn't feeling well, especially with that creepy guy in mind. He knew I needed to get away, just to make my night a little bit enjoyable. As I was leaving, it started to snow. It was the first truly hard snowfall of the season, even though fall had basically just started. I was thankful to have my husband's truck once again. I figured if I took it slow, I'd be safe. I couldn't have been more wrong. Only about a half-mile from work, I ended up sliding into a ditch because I couldn't see the road from all the snow falling. It was all right. It didn't seem like too much damage was done, but of course I couldn't get myself out of the ditch by myself. I called the police, and surprisingly the cops were there in only a minute. I got out of the truck to greet the cops, and that's when it happened. From the bed of the truck, the man from the restaurant jumped out and started to run full speed into the night. I screamed and was at a loss for words. The cops didn't know what to do and started to yell at me to tell them what was going on. I told him, and he radioed some other cops, but they never caught the man. We eventually went back to the restaurant. I gave the police my entire story. They looked at the cameras, but it wasn't enough to ever actually catch the guy. The worst part was watching the video of the man climbing into the bed of my truck to hide. It was no more than 10 minutes after my break had ended. He'd come storming back into the parking lot with his food bag still in his hands. He looked around for a few minutes, tried all the doors, and when he realized it was locked, he jumped into the back. I'm so lucky I drove into a ditch that night, because if I hadn't, who knows what would have happened to me. The bag was left in the back of the truck with the fries still inside. This guy never even wanted the food. He knew my name from the start. He knew when I worked. And he knew my exact vehicle I would have. This happened several years ago, and I'm still not quite ready to work overnights again. Always lock your doors, and please be careful. Some people really are monsters. I'm a detective, but not like the ones you'd see on TV and in the movies. I'm more of a private detective. By that, I mean I don't get involved in any murder cases or anything like that. Most people hire me for family affairs. I get a lot of work from investigating cheating accusations or locating missing or stolen pets. I'm sometimes asked to gather evidence of bullying at schools as well. I had a call one afternoon last summer, and I've told some of my friends about this experience. They've encouraged me to share it. It's the strangest and frankly most disturbing case I've ever handled. So I got a call from a client who was a woman in her 30s. She made arrangements to meet me in person to speak to me about her request. I was taken aback by her beauty when I first laid eyes on her. She was a very talkative woman. It was as if her tongue was afraid of the dark or something. She was very warm and open, and she had come to ask me to find out if her husband was having an affair. I thought to myself, now who the hell would want to cheat on this woman? She had grown suspicious of her husband though. He had started coming home later and later from work. She guessed he was meeting up with someone based on how shifty he had been acting. Whenever she asked him where he had been, he'd just brush her off. She thought he had been cheating on her for about a month or so. I took the job and told her I would trail him when he finished work. I got to his work address and waited in my car until I saw him leave. I was honestly hoping this guy was just trying to put in a few extra hours for his wife and potentially their future. You never want to see anyone actually cheating. But, as in most cases in my line of work, I was wrong. The husband left work at about 6 p.m. His wife told me he had been coming home no earlier than 10 though, so clearly he was up to something during those 4 extra hours, and I was going to find out what that something was. He got into his car, and I tailed him. We drove for quite a while. We left the city area and headed out into the suburbs. I thought to myself he might have met a woman in the city who lived on the outskirts, and to avoid their affair being discovered, he'd meet her out here and never in the city. My theory immediately went out the window though, when we drove right through the suburbs as well and out into the countryside. Now, this wasn't what I was expecting at all. I was quite surprised at this point. There wasn't really anything out there where we were heading. Nothing but a few houses and a couple of abandoned buildings. He led me to the most unexpected place, an abandoned love hotel. He parked up and I turned off my car as to not raise his suspicions. I planned on looping back around to covertly see what he was getting up to. While doing this, I did a search on this abandoned love hotel. Apparently, it went under due to poor management quite a long time ago. I found online that it had closed more than 10 years ago, so what the hell was he doing out there if the hotel was no longer open? If it was still operating, that would be fine. I guess love hotels are kind of self-explanatory. You know, you rent a room for a certain period of time and you get intimate in that room. It's a pretty straightforward thing. A lot of love hotels are so out there and unusual though. They offer all kinds of fulfillments of fantasies. If you want to do it in a themed room like a medieval Game of Thrones kind of scenario, there's definitely a hotel for that. This particular one was catered to all kinds of fantasies. I could just tell by some of the reviews that it really seemed as if nothing was off the table. That said, this place was abandoned, so what exactly was he doing here? I had to pull in and see for myself. I still had a job to do no matter how strange this was. I had to observe and report what was going on. I quietly headed into the abandoned hotel and cautiously walked into the lobby, trying my best to avoid all the debris on the floor. It didn't take long for me to locate which room he was in. I heard strange noises coming from upstairs. A male voice was murmuring, so I followed the sound of those murmurs and I arrived at the room. I could see and hear what was going on through a gap in the door. The man had left it slightly ajar. I peeked inside, and what I saw rendered me speechless. Oh, look at you. You're so beautiful and lovely, and quiet, nice and quiet. The husband was speaking to a naked woman who was lying on the dusty bedspread. The husband began to take off his suit jacket and started loosening his tie. I was almost certain about what was to come next, and I couldn't bear watching that. I was very confused and conflicted. I had to report this to my client, and I knew it was going to be very difficult and likely distressing for the wife. Her reaction and her feelings towards what happened will remain confidential. All I'll say is that my predictions were correct. It was incredibly distressing. I don't know anything about how he explained himself or what motive was behind him doing that. I've thought about it a lot. When I told one of my friends this story, well, she's into creepy online stuff, so you can thank her for me sharing this with you. This happened when I was a student. I had a part-time job in a restaurant. The restaurant closed each night at 3 a.m. I was living in a student city, and by that I mean there was no shortage of students looking for part-time work. I guess you could say I was lucky to have a job at all. One thing about living in such a city is that when it's Obon, everyone heads home. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Obon, so let me explain it quickly. Obon is an annual Buddhist event for commemorating one's ancestors. It's believed that each year during Obon, the ancestors' spirits return to this world in order to visit their relatives. It's mainly observed from August 13th to 16th. The Obon week in mid-August is one of Japan's 3 major holiday seasons. Pretty much all of the student workers were eager to either head home and see their families or simply have some time off for the Obon holidays. I was happy to keep working though. I needed that money. The working rotation would go like this. 1 full-time worker and 2 part-time workers would work most of the night shifts at the restaurant, and that was the same during Obon. The restaurant was in the middle of a row of houses. It was renovated property. That means the houses were detached and not next to the restaurant. That would have been pretty annoying for the residents if that was the case. The second floor of the restaurant wasn't used for customers. It was used as a storage room where we kept equipment and supplies. There were some odd things up there. I don't know if this stuff belonged to the owner of the store, but there were family photos and a Buddhist altar as well. I never liked going up there at night. When I was sent to get supplies, it really creeped me out. The following incident happened on the 13th of August last year. It was the night before Obon officially began, just into the early hours of the actual day. I'll never forget it. It had been a busy night. I was just about to finish my shift. I left the building to turn off the outdoor lighting in front of the restaurant. There was a motion sensor light above the door, so when a customer walked through, it made a ping-pong sound that alerted us workers. When I came back inside, I started to clean the floor in the kitchen, hoping we were done for the night. The other employees were back there in the kitchen with me, and they were cleaning down too. I heard the door sensor go off. I wondered if a customer had just walked through those doors, even though we were about to close. I called out a welcome as a kind of knee-jerk reaction. It was what we had to do every time a customer came through those doors. I went to look and see who was coming through. I was surprised to see that there was no one there. All the lights at the front of the store were off, and it was 3 a.m. now. We didn't usually have customers at that time of night. It was odd. The full-time employee came out from the back, and I looked over to him. He said, "Customer?" I walked back towards him in the kitchen and said, "No." Actually, I could tell he was thinking the same thoughts I was. Then why had we just heard the entrance chime? We looked at one another in silence for a few moments. Then we heard a loud noise coming from the back of the store. It sounded as if something very heavy had just dropped or slammed. Naturally, the last couple of events had creeped us out a bit. Someone was out there, messing with us. We went to look out back, but we didn't see anything out there either. There was no one at all. I guessed it might have been a stray cat knocking something off a high place outside. It had happened before, but this was Obon, and my head slowly started to fill itself with legends and ghost stories, the kind of stuff I had heard from a young age. The dead spirits returning. The logical part of my brain told me it was nothing but a coincidence, and I needed to hurry up and finish my shift. I was thinking a lot of things I can't really remember. It's been a year since this happened. We got fully cleaned down and got everything we needed to do done. Last year, I hadn't worked around this time because I went home to see my family. One of the part-time employees told me something like this happened the year before, too. I wondered if he was trying to purposely scare me or prank me. As we were chatting, I felt as if they were just about to tell me last year what happened, but they were interrupted by the sound of the sensor under the door ping-ponging again. This couldn't be real. This time I didn't say a welcome. I just looked over at the dark entrance. Once again, there was no one there. It was starting to get scary at this point. It was as if something was there, but we just couldn't see it. It almost made me feel like something was watching me, right out of the darkness outside. I didn't think my colleagues were pranking me anymore. I just wanted to leave and go home. Thankfully, I did, without any further spooky happenings going on. I worked the night shift a few times after that, and nothing similar ever happened again. Well, the sensor at the entrance did malfunction a couple of times, but I feel like what happened on Obon was a bit different. I guess it probably doesn't sound as creepy as it was, but in those moments in the dark, with something close by that we couldn't see. I was absolutely terrified. The story I'm going to share took place a little over 11 years ago. At the time, I was a nurse at one of our local hospitals and working primarily in the cardiology floor. I was a relatively new employee at this facility, so I was taking pretty much any shift I could get. A lot of my shifts were overnight shifts, or shifts that started in the late afternoon and went through the middle of the night because of this. At the time, I didn't really mind, but looking back on it now, I have no idea how I wasn't in bed by 10 p.m. every night like I am nowadays. There are probably 1,000 experiences I've had throughout my career that would make for an interesting story, but there's one that sticks out more than any of the others and still bothers me to this day. On the cardiac floors, we allowed different visitation rules than some of our other floors. Due to the sometimes unexpected and catastrophic nature of the illnesses, it wouldn't be uncommon to have visitors get approved to stay a majority of the day or night. If a spouse had just experienced a heart attack, it was natural to have someone stay the entire night, even if they had been stabilized and moved to another floor. There was one particular patient who had their spouse with them for 2 or 3 days as they recovered and worked to get discharged and released home. They were both very nice people, especially my patient, who still remains one of the sweetest people I'd ever met. Her husband, who was nice enough even from the beginning, seemed to have something a little bit off. I remember the wide smile he would have when talking to me or my coworkers. At first, it seemed kind and inviting, but after holding a few minutes of conversation, it got kind of uncomfortable. Anyway, the first occurrence happened on the second night of the stay. I was working an overnight shift, and it was later in the evening. I was at the nurse's station when I saw the light flashing outside the patient's room. That alerted me that they had used the call button to request something. I made my way to the room and went in to check and see what was going on. When I got there, all the lights were off, but the TV was still on. The patient looked to be deep asleep. I was kind of confused. Maybe the patient had accidentally hit it in their sleep. Then I heard someone whisper, "Smells good," right into my ear. I jumped and kind of shrieked. I saw it was the patient's husband. He said, "Oh, it was just me playing a little joke and hiding in the bathroom." He stammered on further. "Yeah, sorry, your hair smells really good." I just kind of stood there in silence for a second and replied, please let me know if there's anything else then. If either of you need anything, just use the call button. If you guys actually need assistance though, not for any random thing." I left the room and went back to the nurse's station, which sat directly across from the bank of elevators. The location was very annoying, because the old elevators made a loud noise when they went up or down. A few hours had passed, and the elevator was making its oh-so-lovely sounds again. It dinged open to the doors on our floor. I looked around the desk, but no one was there. The doors closed, and the elevator went right back down. That was weird. Well, this happened 5 more times in a row. I decided finally to see who was messing around and calling or sending the elevator back and forth. I got into the elevator and went down to the second floor where the doors opened again. There was no one there. Being annoyed, tired, and confused at this point, I went back up to my floor to head back to my desk. When it got back up, the elevator had thankfully stopped its constant noise and movement. However, when I reached for my cup of water, I noticed a folded up piece of paper. I thought maybe it was something I had left there, maybe something I wrote down that I didn't want to forget to do or something. When I unfolded it though, it said, "For my favorite nurse." It was a small drawing of a rose or something. I set it down and looked around to see if anyone was there. I didn't see anyone outside of another nurse though, who was all the way at the other end of the hallway, coming out of a different room. Thankfully, I was able to keep myself busy for the rest of the night, and it was almost time for me to hand off my patients to the next shift. As I was finishing some paperwork, I felt a feeling like someone was behind me or I was being watched very closely. I sat up in my chair and kind of looked around. I saw a head barely poking out of the doorway of a patient's room. Yeah, it was the smells good person from earlier in the night. As soon as he saw my gaze going that way, he popped his head back inside the doorway. I angled my chair so I could see that room, but it still looked like my head was facing my computer. Every so often, I would see a head pop out of the doorway, then dart back into the room. I tried to ignore it as best I could so I could finish my shift and go home and get some much-needed sleep. I did just that and returned to work the next day to find that patient from that room had indeed been discharged. I was getting my new assignments when one of my colleagues said, "I heard you made a new friend last night." I asked what they meant. She said, "One of your patients got discharged today. One of their family members were looking for you and asking for you, wanted to see if you were here. We told him you were gone and we didn't know when your next shift was." When we told them you weren't here, his face went from a smile to a frown and he just walked away. We figured you made a good impression or something. I just smiled at my coworker and went back to reviewing some charts. I will say that things always seem a little more unnerving on the night shift. I've always wondered if that's our subconscious at work or if weird things really do occur more at night. This is the first time I'm trying to share this story, other than with the police the night of the incident. I guess you could technically argue I have no real reason to be as freaked out as I am, since nothing really happened to me, but mentally I'm still scarred. The terror I felt in that moment is something that still shakes me to my very core. I used to work for a service that would go to various businesses and clean, mop, and wax the floors. As you may expect, this type of work may be tough when there are workers or customers walking around. Because of that, the company works in the middle of the night so as to not disturb any of the businesses. I personally only work for this company once a week for some extra money. I was saving for a house with my soon-to-be wife. The business was great, but getting help was not. It got to a point where the owner would send all of us to different business locations to basically work alone. That was unless it was a big business or a hospital or something that you couldn't reasonably be expected to do by yourself. This specific night I was alone, which I really didn't mind all that much. I put my headphones in and got to work on the floors. It was really mindless work, which was great for me because that made it easy money. In the town where I lived, there's a small grocery store that's popular amongst the locals. This store is one of our clients. I would usually tackle this entire store by myself about once a month or so. The night started just like every other night. I started with my sweep and then got ready to mop the floors with the machinery. Every so often when doing the floors, you have to go back and empty the machine, which is filled with water. While I was draining the hose, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye moving around on the sales floor. I knew nobody was supposed to be in the store right now, so I figured my mind must just be playing tricks on me. Maybe my boss had showed up or something. Neither of those were that unlikely. I paused my music and took my headphones out for a minute. I set my phone and headphones on the counter next to where I was disposing of the water. I slowly walked back out there and walked around for a minute to see if I could see anything. I walked to the front end of the store, and just as I was getting ready to head back to the floor machine, I heard voices. I froze in place for a moment, trying to process what was going on here. Then, seconds later, I realized that these were not voices I was supposed to be hearing. Without thinking, I jumped into one of those little cashier's nooks and stayed hidden. There were at least 2 men that I could hear. They were arguing about something, just bickering back and forth. One of the voices sounded like an older, perhaps middle-aged man. The other voice I heard was definitely that of a younger man, maybe in his 20s or so. I stayed in that cashier's nook, laying in a fetal position, just hoping that whatever was happening was not that serious. The men sounded like they were standing nearby to the cash register I was hiding behind. The older man said to the younger man, "Okay, you got the information? Let's get it and get out of here." I heard them walking away, and that's when I grabbed my first glimpse of the intruders. I was able to confirm it was indeed just two men. One of them was freakishly large, and the other man was what you probably may consider to be average size. They were at the customer desk, trying to open what I assumed was a safe or small vault of some kind. At least from where I was, it looked like a safe of some sort. The younger guy was trying to crack it open, while the older guy was harassing him, saying things like, "Hurry up or I'll knock you out." Even crazier and equally disturbing threats. And that's when I noticed the most scary thing. Both these men had loaded weapons, like real actual guns. They both had several weapons in their waistband, in fact. I didn't dare test these men to see if they knew how to use them. My first instinct was to call the police, but my phone was still in the back with the floor machine. I decided the best and most efficient course of action was to stay hidden. If I hid, hopefully this horrifying event would be over soon. I didn't have my phone or watch, so I didn't know how long I was hiding there. It felt like I had to have been there for more than 10 minutes. That's when I heard the bigger guy yell out, "You idiot!" I heard both men running out of the building. I slowly peeked over the ledge and didn't see anybody. I stayed hidden for a few minutes until I was sure I was alone. I finally got up and ran towards the back where I'd left my phone. I immediately called the authorities and my boss. Before I knew it, a middle-aged man was standing in the doorway with a police officer. A brief mix-up ensued as the middle-aged man assumed I was the one trying to rob the store. This middle-aged man was the owner, who got a call from the security company who monitors it. Somehow, the intruders had tripped the alarm when leaving, but not when entering. When the police and owners showed up, I guess I looked pretty guilty. Thankfully, it only took a few moments to clear my name, and I was able to give my side of the story. As far as I know, they never caught those guys. At least, I've never heard so from my boss, or anybody else that the robbers were caught. If I Google the incident, it doesn't even really come up, leading me to believe that the investigation just kind of ended or never really got solved. This was a horrible night for me. I assume those men had some familiarity with the store, since they knew exactly what they were doing. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, sometimes the best thing to do is just stay quiet and stay hidden. Your life is way more important than being a hero. This happened pretty recently, and because of it, I'll be quitting my job at the end of this month. My current job is to deliver papers to homes in the mountains, basically in the middle of nowhere. It's pretty tough because I start work at midnight in order to get all of my deliveries done, and it doesn't exactly pay well either. Still though, it's good to be having any work, especially when you're young. You have your own money and it's nice. Right. Anyway, like I said, I start at midnight, and I don't finish until the sun starts coming up. Sometimes in the darker months, the sun doesn't come up at all. Being out in the mountains alone at night can be pretty spooky, as I'm sure you might imagine. I want to share this recent scary experience with you. This happened in winter. I had gotten used to the rhythm of deliveries by that point. It was around winter that the newspaper company I worked for was trying to expand their business. This would mean there would be more work for me. I was excited to earn a bit more money, but over time it became more and more time-consuming. Basically, a subscription would come in and then it would be down to me to deliver it to the customer. So I'm usually riding my bike around with a big map because signal is a no-go in the mountains. I don't mean a pushback, by the way. I mean a really low-quality motorbike, low CCs. The people who buy these subscriptions have the amazing ability to be unfindable somehow. It was never a straightforward task to find their homes. I had one of those subscription jobs on that winter night. I knew the address, and I knew it wasn't going to be easy. There were a few roads through forest areas, and even worse was the fact that some of the roads were very narrow. I could barely even fit my bike along them. I set off and rode my bike right up to the point where the narrow roads began. Since it was winter, I figured it would be safer to just park my bike and deliver the subscription on foot. There was a footpath after all. There was a post box at the end of the customer's driveway. It was a short distance away from the house. I started down the sloped road towards the post box, and then I froze in my tracks. I could hear the sound of a dog barking. No, not just one dog. It sounded like there were at least two. I thought not much of it and approached the post box with the subscription in hand. It was still pretty much pitch black out despite it being early morning. As I approached, I noticed the light go on at the front door. There was an old lady stood outside on the porch. Seeing her gave me a real fright. I thought to myself, wow, someone's super eager for the morning paper. I figured that since she was out, I could literally just put the subscription in her hand, so I approached her. I stopped when she started yelling at me. "It's right here. I'm delivering the newspaper and your subscription." The boss made us wear a uniform, and we had to wear an ID card around our neck as well. Some customers, especially ones like this who live in remote areas, can be real skeptical of people they don't know. You know, stranger danger and all that. I raised my ID badge, as I assumed she could see me pretty well. "You expect me to believe that's proof?" she screamed at me. I could see the dogs now, especially the whites of their teeth, as they bared them at me and snarled. The old woman then pulled out a pair of long gardening shears from behind her back and pointed them at me. I instinctively backed away. I just tried to remain as calm as possible. I was wondering if this woman was suffering some kind of disease, maybe something like dementia. If she came at me with those long scissors, I planned on kicking her in the abdomen. I practiced full contact karate. However, she was an old lady, and I didn't know if that would really hurt her badly. I hoped it really wouldn't come to that. I just told her, "Well, okay then, I'll just leave this here and be on my way." With that, I turned to leave. I didn't get paid enough to deal with this bullshit. I upped my pace. The old lady was still shouting at me from behind. It sounded as if she was getting really riled up. The dogs were really barking at me now. I turned around to look over my shoulder, and I saw her let go of their leashes. She was walking towards me, slashing at the air with her scissors. She wasn't making any sense at all. I couldn't make out a single word she was shouting at me. It was time to run now. I raced up the hill as I heard the dogs chasing behind me. I couldn't believe it. She'd literally released the hounds on me. I ran up the hill as fast as I could. I needed to get back to my motorbike. I got back on my bike, kicked out the stand, and hopped on. I started the engine and had a quick look behind me. I saw the tips of the dogs' heads coming up the slope. I pulled away without looking back again. It was really scary, to be honest. I think myself incredibly lucky to get out of there without any injuries at all. I mean, it would be a much different story if I had a push bike. Those dogs wanting to bite me. I could tell the old woman looked as if she would have joined in too. I imagined her plunging those large gardening scissors into my gut. I shudder at the thought now. After I delivered the rest of my newspapers and subscriptions, I spoke with my boss and told him about my close call. He decided he would make contact with the customer and see what was going on. I could already imagine him taking the side of the customer immediately. That was just the kind of guy he was. When he checked, however, he found the customer's phone number was no longer in use. He decided to go out there himself and speak to the customer in person. I told him to watch out for the dogs. He said he would let me know how it went when I came back to work the next time. I spoke to him the next day, and he told me he did go out there to meet the customer. He found nothing but an abandoned house, though. He then made contact with the subscription company to find out why someone would want to send a subscription to an empty home. It was at this point we learned the subscription company had fudged the numbers to make our company take their business. They wanted it to look like they had more customers than they actually did. That meant they gave out a couple of random addresses for abandoned homes. That's stupid. So who the hell was that woman with the dogs then? I have no idea. When I think back to how hate-filled her face was, it just gives me the shivers, hence my resignation from the newspaper company. Anyway, I'm still working till the end of the month, so I hope I don't get sent anywhere near the scissor woman's house. I only have a couple of days left of work. I'm sure it will be fine. Back when I was a student at college, I used to work part-time. I picked up a night shift at a local bar, and I really enjoyed working there. On the night that this took place, an older gentleman was already drinking in the bar when I came in to start my night shift. As soon as he saw me stood behind the counter, he got up from his seat and came over to the bar with a smile on his face. When he approached the bar, he struck up a conversation with me. I knew this guy quite well. He was a regular and very quiet. He was usually very nice. We had spoken a few times before, and he was alright in my books. Now, I have to say that the content from here on in is somewhat incoherent. If you don't understand what this guy said, then you'll be feeling the exact same as I did at the time. The old man approached me and randomly said the following: "From now on, it's China's time. You'll see to whatever's left, won't you?" He reached out his hands, both of them, and I in return offered my hands out to him as we joined hands in a sort of strange double handshake. He was smiling so hard it was hard to refuse. To be honest, I don't really like hand touching. I don't know why, it just kinda makes me feel all clammy. I let him know because he seemed to be really enjoying himself. My manager would always say, if they go home smiling, then you've done a really good job. The old man had a big old smile on his face. It looked like he'd probably bought more than a couple of drinks, so for the sake of my job, I endured this. I smiled along and thought to myself, oh great, this guy's so drunk. I glanced over at the table he had come from and noticed something. He had a beer there and some kind of side snack dish. That wasn't unusual, to be honest. What was slightly unusual was the fact that neither of them looked touched or opened. I guess that he wasn't hungry. To be honest, I couldn't really care less as long as he was buying. I was just starting my shift anyway. Shortly after we spoke, the old man headed out the door, and I thought nothing more of it. In the early hours of the morning, my manager at the bar received a call. It was the police calling. Apparently, they had found a body. They had multiple questions. The old man had been found dead. He was lying in a street near an intersection, just a small ways away from our bar. Apparently, he was found quite quickly and taken to the hospital. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do for him. He was pronounced dead immediately. His death was apparently somewhat suspicious, and that's why my manager was being contacted. It was evident the man had been struck on the head by something or someone. The old man had receipts in his wallet from our bar. Naturally, the police thought our place would be a good starting point to make their inquiry. The officer asked the manager if he had noticed anything strange about the old man's demeanor, or if he acted differently at all. The manager answered no. I guess he wasn't paying the old man much attention, or didn't speak to him all that much that night. It transpired that the old man had suffered a head injury before he came to the bar. He then interacted with everyone and collapsed soon after he left. That's why he'd been behaving so strangely. I wondered to myself, so when the old man said, "You'll see whatever's left, won't you?" did that mean something? The way he smiled will always stay with me. Did he know? Did he know he was going to die? Maybe he knew he had a head injury and was trying to get help in the only way he could. Or maybe he knew there wasn't much time left for him. Maybe he wanted to go to a place that made him happy. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but those words he said will always stay with me. We were able to notify his next of kin. It's a really good thing we were asked, because he was sort of an enigma in town. Apparently, not that many people knew him. Hopefully, I succeeded with his request in that respect. We toasted his memory on the following night shift, and that was that. This is my sister's friend's story. I found it pretty creepy, so I figured you guys would too. My sister works as a nurse. When she was a student, she was sent to various hospitals to work with other nurses. This was the same for all her other student friends. My sister heard this story when she met up with one of her close friends. She said that even though they were sat in a warm coffee shop when she heard this, she still had chills race up her spine. So, the hospital that my sister's close friend worked at was in a rural location. It wasn't your typical busy hospital. It didn't have that many patients. She was working the night shift on the night this took place, doing her rounds and checking on the patients as usual. There were only a few patients in her ward. They say those long, dark hospital hallways can be quite eerie in the dead of night. My sister and her friend tell me you get used to that kind of thing after a while, though. I don't know if I ever could. I'm a bit of a scaredy cat. After doing her rounds, she headed back to the nurse's station to see how her colleagues on the night shift were hanging. She was there updating some of her paperwork and chatting when she heard an alert. When a nurse call button is pressed, it sends an alert to the nurse's station. A patient needed some attention. There was one problem, though. The room in which the nurse call had come from was apparently a vacant room that had been empty ever since the patient had passed away in it last week. "Is this a prank?" one of her colleagues asked. "Well, someone pressed the call button, so I guess I better go check it," she replied. She was a little bit scared, of course, but since she was a student nurse, she thought she would show some initiative rather than just be told to do it. She was the youngest and got bossed around the most, so off she went to investigate this call from the empty room. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she walked down that hallway. She had always been terrified by the thought of the paranormal. She went down to the corner room in which the call had come from. She opened the door and stepped inside that dark, unused hospital room. There was no one in there. It was just an empty room as far as she could see. Maybe it was just a malfunction. A ghost in the machine, so to say. It was hard to say what it was. She guessed it could have been a prank, too. Maybe some bored patient started scampering around the ward, then quickly ran back to bed. Maybe the button was broken. It could have been a large number of things. She turned to leave the room and put her hand against the door to push it open. Only it wouldn't budge. It was now locked. How on earth? She began to panic. She started beating her hands against that door with all her strength. Her logical thoughts had gone out the window. Now she was thinking of the paranormal. She knew the call could only come when a button was directly pressed. Something called her into that hospital room, and now that same something didn't want her to leave. One of her colleagues came rushing over to the room she was trapped in and opened it from the outside. My sister's friend was an absolute mess. She was completely petrified. She said she didn't feel alone in that room, like something was hiding in the shadows with her. Hospitals can be pretty scary places when you think about all that goes on in there. I mean, there must be some residual energy trapped in some of the rooms. She requested a transfer to a different hospital after that frightening experience. I wonder what it must have felt like to be trapped in that dark room and unable to get out. Last year, I moved to another city after finishing high school. I assessed several college options and decided on one that would have me move roughly 3 hours away. I found an apartment where I was able to live without roommates, and that was in a safe part of town with a reasonable rent as well. It was close to some attractions in the city too, which was an added bonus to me, as it would allow me to have a reasonable social life. For the first 4 months or so, it was actually really great. There were absolutely no problems or safety concerns of any sort. I managed to become good friends with a guy who studied at the same college as me. It just so happened that he lived around 5 minutes away from me, so we would often hang out at each other's places. One night, just as winter started, he called me over to play video games and hang out. We had a pretty chill night, drank a few beers, and had a good few laughs. We enjoyed ourselves quite a bit. At around 1 a.m., we decided to call it a wrap for the night, and I headed home to my apartment. When I got back home, I decided to head out on the balcony for a moment that overlooked the entrance of my building. I wanted to have a cigarette and take in the scenery. I vividly remember looking all around and not seeing anybody out and about. It was a cold winter night and it wasn't the weekend, so understandably everybody was probably at home. Beside the usual car or two passing by, it was dead silent. Once I finished my cigarette, I decided to call it a night myself and got ready for bed. I was understandably confused when I suddenly heard a short ring on my doorbell. I stood in the center of my room for a good few seconds in confusion. A little bit of fear set in. I snapped out of it though and decided to tiptoe over to my door and try and see if anyone was outside. My immediate thought was that my friend must have come over to drop something off. Maybe I'd forgotten something. But then, after a bit more thinking, I thought to myself, surely he would have texted me or called me then. I listened out for about half a minute or so, when the person once again rang the doorbell and softly knocked a few times. I was completely still and didn't want to make a sound so I wouldn't give away the fact I was at the door. I heard the stranger pacing around outside for a few seconds before he stopped in front of the door again. I waited to hear any sort of noise, but it was quiet. That was when I decided to look through the peephole to see that hopefully he would have left. I picked up the lid cover of the peephole and took a look out. My legs pretty much went numb as I saw a hooded figure standing outside, looking straight into the peephole. He was holding the zipper of his hoodie so as to cover his entire face. All I could really make out was his forehead. He must have either heard me lift the cover or heard my heavy breathing, because right away he moved from the peephole and called out to me. "I know you're there at the door." By this point, I was pretty much shivering in fear, but I mustered up the courage to say I was calling the cops. He just laughed at me. "Ha, sure thing, big guy." He proceeded to wipe away the door handle with his sleeve before walking off. I understandably called the police, and when they came over, they informed me that I wasn't the only one this had happened to. He'd been doing this for at least a month, and they suspected him of at least one home invasion, where thankfully the father had chased him out of the house. I crashed at my friend's house for around a week or so after this, before going back to my own place. It's been a year since then, and I've never heard any further news about him. He could have been arrested by now, but as far as I know, he hasn't. I find it more likely he simply moved on to a different area. I'm not sure if he had any violent intention or not, but either way, I hope I don't ever encounter him again. This happened about 10 years ago when I was on summer break. I was 15 years old. I grew up in a very run-of-the-mill, middle-class neighborhood in San Antonio. Our house sat on a corner, and the fence around the backyard had horizontal wooden beams that almost made an X, as opposed to a vertical fence post that I'm more familiar with. Because of this, there were larger gaps in between the beams, and peeking through was fairly easy. Another detail worth noting, our back gate on the side of the house near the road had been wide open many mornings. Because of this, my dad had looped some wire through the latch and twisted it like a bread tie to keep it engaged. We'd close it every time, but somehow it still kept ending up open. In the backyard, there was a large deck and an above-ground pool that the deck was built up to on one end. A huge, beautiful oak tree shaded the deck and part of the pool closest to the house, so my sister and I would anchor our feet at the farthest edge and sunbathe on our floats. This happened on a Sunday. My grandfather was visiting, and he and my parents were inside napping. My older sister was gone with her friends to a different pool, and I decided to go float about in the backyard. My mom closed the blinds to the back and habitually locked the back door before laying down on the couch to snooze. As I was in the pool for about 20 minutes, I noticed that someone was standing on the other side of the fence, peeking in. The sun was shining in my face, so I couldn't see him that well. I did find it quite weird, but I didn't say anything. I saw the person walk off, and I didn't think that much about it. Minutes passed by, and I decided to actually swim around a bit and cool off, then get back on the float. This time on my stomach, though, with my face looking up at the house instead of towards the fence. It felt like just a minute had passed by when I heard the sudden sound of wood creaking. I turned around, only to see a man now halfway over my back fence, about 15 feet away from me. Once he hit the ground, part of me was in shock. I froze for a moment before sheer terror and panic took over. This is not a dream. This was really happening, and I needed to get back inside right now. I felt as though that small pool had become Olympic-sized. I couldn't get to the edge and climb out fast enough. By the time I made it out of the pool and started running to the back door, the man had already made his way around it and was up on the deck coming towards me. He appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s, pretty thin and around my height, 5'9". He was just walking with purpose the entire time and never spoke a single word. I got to the back door only to find it locked. I started screaming for them to let me in and pounding on the door. At least my mom was right there to unlock it, but those 30 seconds felt like 10 minutes. When my mom finally opened the door, the man was just standing right behind me with this blank look in his eyes. I was crying, my grandpa was freaking out, and the man was just standing there looking inside at me. My dad ran downstairs and went crazy, screaming at the man and pushing him, telling him to get the hell out of here. My mom was on the phone with the police at this point, and the next moment makes the whole thing 10 times creepier. The man turned around, walked around the house over to our back gate, which had the wire in the latch, mind you, and untwisted it. He pushed through, leaving the gate wide open, as it normally was. He walked back across the street and went into our neighbor's house. The police arrived soon after. It turned out the man had been staying with his sister for the past 8 weeks and was on parole/recently released from jail. Theft and assault charges, I believe. He had broken into a different neighbor's home and stolen some china and a few of their family photos. He went back to jail soon after, and we never found the back gate left open again. I still get chills thinking about this, because my sister and I both had our bedrooms downstairs, with our windows facing the backyard. I just know he was coming in there and watching us at night. My parents moved out of this home a few years later when I went to college, but I slept upstairs on a pull-out couch for months after this, and I'll never live on the ground floor again, if I can help it. My name is Ben, and I live in Australia. In the southeast of Australia lies the state of Victoria, and in that state lies the High Country, an extremely vast and remote expanse of alpine mountains and valleys that's largely only accessible by 4-wheel drive and takes days to get in and out of. The place is popular with 4-wheel drivers, deer hunters, and hikers as well. We 4WD, and this was the destination chosen to go camping for a few days with my partner Jess and I. Some time away from the world beyond the reach of mobile phones. The 4WD was loaded up, lists double-checked, vehicle maintenance done, fuel loaded onto the roof racks, the police station closest to our destination notified of our trip, and off we went. We were headed to a place called the Wanangata Valley, a remote valley deep in the high country. A huge amphitheater-type valley, with alpine mountains rising high in every direction, and a river running along the valley floor. Towards the end of the first full day of driving, we finally made our way down the last track for the day, skirting the ridge and arriving at the valley floor, just as the sun dipped below the mountains. We found a secluded spot to pitch our tent, nested in amongst the trees by the riverbank. It was a midweek and off-season, so we were the only ones there that we knew of. After setting up camp and having a meal by the fire as the sun went down, we snuggled up together in our sleeping bags and in short order decided to hit the hay. At some point in the night, though, I awoke to a loud noise outside. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, so from the inside of our tent I listened. I didn't hear anything else. I thought I must have been going mad. No sooner than I'd thought that, though, I heard another noise. It sounded like something falling off our camp table and hitting the ground. I put it down to possums or wombats messing about, common in the area, and nothing to worry about. I should have packed up after dinner, I thought, and simply went back to sleep. Sunrise came and we slowly woke up. Needing to pee, I opened the tent and jumped out. Looking around, though, something came over me, a chill. It was not the way we'd left it. Instead of seeing two chairs together by the fire where we'd been sitting, one of them was by the table, and on the table was a loaf of bread I swore I'd packed away the night before. I walked over to the table to inspect. A half-eaten piece of bread was sitting right there, with a very obvious chomp mark taken out of it. I flung the tent open. "Were you up before me? Did you have some bread?" "No," was the answer. Jess and I got up together and went through all of our stuff. Nothing seemed to be missing. As we went to check the vehicle, I noticed footprints. There were a bunch of them around the front of the car where the hood was. Most of the camp was covered with grass. This was one of the only few spots that was just dirt. Had someone tried to open it? There were very distinct footprints, not mine or my partner's. Maybe they'd already been there before we got there. These camping spots are used intermittently, and obviously we weren't looking at the ground when we arrived the night before, with the sun setting and all. I don't think either of us wanted to actually admit what we were both thinking, that someone had been creeping about our campsite in the night, far from civilization. We discussed if a possum could have made the bite marks, and argued about if one of us had left the bread out on accident. We eventually discussed moving on and camping somewhere else instead. After much deliberation, though, we decided to stay. I had the rifle in the vehicle, and I guess that gave me an overinflated sense of safety. In hindsight, it was a very poor choice. As the day rolled on and the sun shining and nothing eventful happening, I decided to walk across the valley floor, about 800 meters to an old ruin of an isolated homestead, probably built by settlers who ran cattle in the valley some hundreds of years ago. Steeped in mystery, really. There's an old unsolved murder from 1917 that always captivates people too. I read the plaque, took some photos, and started wandering back to camp. As I neared the halfway mark back, I noticed Jess was walking across the field towards me. Must have gotten bored, I thought. As she approached, though, it was clear she was in a panic. Immediately, she started telling me how she went down to the riverbank to wash the pots and pans, when, as she looked up, she saw someone over on the other side of the river, watching her from deep in the bush. I had no reason whatsoever not to believe her. I asked about what he looked like, and got told an old man, 70 or thereabouts, scraggly looking and in old tattered clothes. Apparently, the second he'd noticed she'd noticed him. He got up and walked away, disappearing into the impenetrable brush. I couldn't comprehend it. How was anyone out here without a four-wheel drive or a dirt bike? And how would anyone get to that side of the bank without first crossing over from our side? There's days worth of damn near impossible to walk through foliage on the other side just to get to where my partner saw him. We decided to jump in the vehicle and drive along the length of the alley, checking the dozen or so riverside camping spots as we went. I wanted to spot a camp, have my partner ID the guy, and make sure he wasn't creeping, our theory being that he may have been a hunter. After making our way up and down the valley and not seeing anything though, we drove back to camp at a loss to explain anything. As the sun started to set and with my partner and I quite shaken now, I grabbed the rifle and sat it next to us as we cooked dinner and chatted, having drinks to settle the nerves. We talked a bit and settled into a good foot warming in front of the fire. At some point, Jess needed to go to the toilet. I was asked to come with her to the spot behind a tree where we'd placed the portable toilet. Considering everything that had gone on, it was a no-brainer. Jess did her business and we turned around and came around the side of the tree. That's when we saw him, standing in our camp about a meter from the rifle I had sitting against the table, was an old man. Jess squeezed my arm so hard I thought it was going to come off. Everything about her body language screamed, "This is him." As we got closer, I could make out some more odd things about him. He had part of a deer antler in his hand that looked like he'd been whittling away at it, and what looked like antler pieces carved to plug large holes in his ears. Same goes for the bone-looking buttons on his ratty old coat. He wore leather shoes that looked homemade. "Good day," he said. "Fuck me, mate, you gave us a fucking heart attack," I said. "Where have you come from? Everything all right?" "Just over yonder. You lot aren't hunting anything around here, are you?" He looked directly at the rifle. "We might be. Why?" "Oh, there's no hunting around here. Not enough deer as it is." "Well, we hadn't decided on it. Probably packing up soon anyway." I edged my way towards the rifle. "I should put this away. I didn't mean to spook you," I said, looking for an excuse to grab it up in my hands. "It's all good. Things like that don't spook me." I picked up the rifle by the barrel and held it like a walking stick in an attempt to be non-confrontational. "No offense, but you really caught us by surprise there. You gotta be the only person we've seen since we got here." "Yeah, I saw you come in last night. I've been coming up here for 40 years. Beautiful spot, isn't it? Takes a bit to get down into the valley, eh?" "Yeah, man, look, no offense, but we're gonna hit the sack soon. Do you need a lift back or something?" "No, all good. Just out for a wander before I tuck in for the night. I saw the fire and thought I'd say hello. Anyway, I'd better be on my way." With that, he turned around and walked off into the dark, no torch in hand. That was officially enough to spook us beyond any ability to calm down. We decided to pack up in the dark and head out, even if driving in the dark was monumentally stupid in this part of the high country. We got in and drove out, taking us along the valley floor. We didn't see a single fire, camp, vehicle, nothing. We kept on driving. Halfway home, Jess, bored from the drive, flipped on the camera. The memory card was missing. After getting home and telling a few people what happened, my friend's dad, an avid bushman himself, was the one to officially freak us the hell out. "Oh, you met the Button Man." "The what now?" I said. "The Button Man. He's an old bushman who goes out into the high country for months at a time, hunts with a spear, appears out of nowhere. He loves scaring people, has these buttons made out of bone. There's a lot of people that go missing up that way. The cops keep looking, but they can't find a single trace. Campers, hikers, one camp was found burnt to the ground and the car left abandoned. Can't find any evidence at all." A quick Google search after confirmed it to my surprise. The missing people, the Button Man, the lack of evidence. Police set out into the bush and found his camp, spoke with the man too, but found nothing else to go on. During my research, I found out that not only is he very real, dozens have met him. He always appears out of nowhere at their camp, but as for his connection to any of the missing people, Only he can know. We don't camp that valley anymore. Hell, we don't camp that side of the high country anymore. Anyway, that's our story of how we met the Button Man. Let me first say that this story is a little bit depressing, and it makes me feel sad writing it down. But that doesn't change the fact that this was one of the most frightening nights of my entire life. My father passed away when I was 4 or 5 years old, and my mom met David when I was 10. He ended up adopting me several years later. Even though he wasn't my real father, he raised me as though I was his own daughter, and I loved him like he was my real dad. You know what? Scratch that. I hate that phrase, real dad. Because he wasn't like a real father. He was my father. He was a great man and treated my mother and I like we were the most important things in the world. Unfortunately, a few months back, David passed away. He got sick very suddenly and died not long after. It was a sad event, and it hit my mom especially hard. He was old, but it didn't hurt any less. My elderly mother was already declining in her health, and we were worried this may be the final straw that broke her back. A few nights after the funeral, my mom began to call me in the middle of the night. Every time I thought, oh no, and figured the worst. It was bad, but not that type of bad. She was absolutely terrified. 2 nights in a row, she called me and claimed that somebody was in her house, and she could hear them moving around. She was incredibly scared. My husband and I felt horrible on both days we went over and searched the entire house, only to find nothing out of place. It didn't look like anybody broke in, nothing was stolen, and we triple-checked that everything was locked up tight. On the 3rd day, my mom finally begged me to stay overnight. This was so if the intruder showed up again, I could witness and either stop them or call the police or something. Honestly, I just thought my mom was really tired and dreaming, and thinking her dreams are real or something. At some point during the night, I thought that I heard someone or something coming from the dining room. It was pretty jarring, because it was clearly a voice. For a single second, I thought my mom might be right, and there really were people breaking into the home. I slowly got off the couch and started to head towards this noise. I ruled out ghosts immediately, because I'm not really into any of that. I started to think that maybe it was someone homeless or something, and they were squatting inside an elderly person's home. All these ideas were running through my head a million miles an hour as I was drawing closer to the noise. When I was only 1 room away, I could hear the voice more clearly. It was my mom. I stopped sneaking at that point and walked into the dining room. My mom was sitting at the head of the table, having a full-blown conversation with nobody. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. Her eyes were wide open, but they were almost glazed over. She was awake and asleep at the same time. She never looked in my direction, but she seemed to know that I walked in. In a cheerful voice, she said, "Hello, dear. I'm just enjoying some time with David." I looked over, and the chair next to her was slightly pulled out, like my mom had pulled it out for someone to sit in. I got closer to her, and when I saw her eyes, they were even more disturbing. It was like I could only see the white parts of them. Mix that with her eerie smile and talking in the moment, and it was incredibly creepy. I gently tried to remind my mother that David had passed away. She just laughed and waved her hand in my face. "You're so silly. David's sitting right there." I was at a loss for words. I didn't know the correct way to handle this. Do I just make my grieving and elderly mother happy and let her think she's talking to her dead husband? Or do I try to wrangle her way back to reality and crush her with heartbreak? She grabbed my hand, still not looking in my direction or changing her facial features in any way. "You can leave now, sweetie. I don't know why I was so scared. It was just David cleaning the house that I heard last night. It was just David." I remember word for word. She just kept repeating that last part. Her sleep talking devolved into gibberish. Then, every once in a while, I would hear the name David slip out of her mouth. I didn't realize until that night just how hard my mother took the loss and how fragile her mind had become. When I tried to move, my mother snapped and growled at me like she was a wild animal. "Don't touch me! I'm talking to him!" I called my husband, and he met me over there. We decided to call 911 because we didn't know what else to do. They tried to take her to the hospital, but she became extremely hostile and violent. Not because we were taking her from her home, mind you, but because we were taking her from David. She kept saying she wasn't allowed to leave because David wanted her there. The mind can truly conjure up anything when it's hurting. My mother passed away not long after that night, God rest her soul. She never came back to herself after that night. Her half-opened eyes and sleepwalking appearance never went away. The doctors told me she had some type of nervous breakdown, and due to her age, she could no longer separate reality from her mind. It really is so sad. When my biological father passed away, my mom was a wreck, but buried those emotions to raise me. David saved her in so many ways, so when she lost him, it was like she lost everything in that moment. I'm sorry if the story was a bit of a downer, but I'll never forget how my mother was acting that night. I'm a skeptical person myself, but a part of me almost believes that David really was there with her. It's creepy. The mind is an insane tool. Even just my mom thinking the man was sitting with her freaks me out a little bit. Take care of yourself, folks, and tell your loved ones you love them any chance you get. I think the word toxic is actually toxic. We throw the word around like it's some sort of frisbee. One topic that's always got brought up in that toxic conversation is toxic exes. How exes are terrible. Not all exes are bad, mind you, but the ones that are, I truly think encompass the word toxic. You see, I was engaged a few years ago, and it ended very poorly. My fiance got a job about 100 miles from our hometown, so I moved with her and started a life there. I didn't have friends or family or anyone to turn to when we broke up, and because of the job I'd started, I decided not to head home just yet. It's not important how things ended, but they did end very poorly. She begged me to come back at the end, but I couldn't put myself through all of that all over again. Not right after the breakup. She kept the house, and I found a small one-bedroom apartment. I just hoped I would be able to meet some new friends, which I'm really bad at, by the way. A few weeks after we'd broken up, I was sitting in the apartment sulking, which was my favorite hobby around that time. The apartment was on the first floor of the building, which was really like the half-basement, if that makes any sense. My windows were at level 1. It was just my head that was above ground. The rest of the apartment was below it. I had a lovely view of absolutely nothing to help me cope with my crippling depression at the time. One night, while I was just sort of being a bum, my power went out. We were having a pretty bad storm. The last time we'd had a storm like this, the power had gone out for several hours. I knew I couldn't just sit there in silence, and since it was getting late, I couldn't really go anywhere anyway, even though I probably wouldn't have if I could. I lit up a few candles that I had, and sat at my table. It was a small table that only fit 2 chairs. I loved to draw and color in high school, and I had some talent before I gave it up. This was the perfect opportunity for me to draw and just sort of get lost in something that I used to love. While I was drawing, trying to get my mind off the events going on in my life, I heard something. It was a loud noise that sounded close by. Unfortunately, it was too dark to see everywhere in my apartment, other than the little area I was sitting in with the candles. I slowly walked over to where I heard the noise. Lying at my window outside was what looked to be some sort of figure. I jumped back because I was scared. I knew this was a crazy idea. No one would break into this apartment. They would have to get on their stomach and practically crawl inside. Not to mention, hardly anyone in town even knows who I am. I went back to the small table and blew the candles out. I wanted to use the darkness to my advantage and be able to see out the window better. I didn't know for sure what I was seeing at this point, and it's possible it could have just been a skunk or something trying to escape the storm. I just didn't know. I went back over to the window, and I could see it clearly now. This was no animal, and it was not my imagination either. Lying against the ground, trying to open the window, was a person dressed in all black clothes. I freaked out. I didn't know what to do. The obvious answer was to call the police or the authorities or whoever, but I don't know why. In the heat of the moment, that just didn't cross my mind. The only person I really knew was my ex-fiance. I decided to give in to my fear and loneliness and call her for help. Right as I pressed call, though, a light could be seen shining out through the window, and a brief melody of a ringtone could be heard. The call went right to voicemail after that. Knowing what was most likely happening, I decided to call right back and see if it was just a coincidence. Sure enough, the light and ringtone went off for a split second before the intruder outside shut it off. It was my ex, trying to break into my apartment. Why at this hour in this weather? Her intentions were clearly sinister. I started to yell, but she kept trying to break in through the window. Thankfully, it remained locked, and I called the police. As soon as she heard me on the phone, I saw her get up and run off. I told the cops everything when they arrived. They actually didn't believe me right away. They looked almost annoyed, like I was bothering them with this. But when they looked out the window, they could see the spot in the dirt where someone had been laying down, and there were clearly signs of forced entry. They finally agreed to follow up and see where my ex was. When the cops went and questioned her, of course she seemed to deny everything, which didn't really surprise me. She said that she had been with her new boyfriend and that I needed to move on. The guy also vouched for her. He said that she was at the house the entire night with him. Either this guy was in on it, or she was already manipulating him. I caught her out for being a liar, and I was the one who was branded a liar and crazy ex at the end of it. When I brought up that I'd called her twice and both times the phone lit up, she said her phone was broken so it couldn't have been her. That was it for me. I couldn't live in this town anymore. Now that I didn't feel safe being here, I paid an early termination fee for my lease and moved away to stay with my family until I got back on my feet. I've never heard from her again, and I'm so thankful for that. My life is much better without that toxic human being ruining it. It was winter break freshman year of college. I drove up to visit one of my friends in northwestern Pennsylvania for New Year's. I needed to be back home the next day for work, so I decided to drive back at around 2 a.m. in the morning. I was driving down Interstate 79. For anyone reading this from Pennsylvania, it was Grove City where this event took place. I saw maybe 2 cars in that entire 60-mile span. I came up around a bend and saw what looked like a black bear in my lane. I swerved and went off the road. I crashed into the tree line next to the highway. I was in the middle of nowhere now, and the bear just booked it off into the woods. My car was completely totaled, and I knew I wasn't going to be seeing anyone around for hours to help me out. I called 911, and they said they would be there in around 30 minutes. I got out of the car and stood on the shoulder of the highway to wait. After about 5 minutes, though, I heard some rustling in the bushes, and there it was. The bear emerged. It turns out that when I slipped off the road, I hit a cub, and the mama bear was now pissed as all hell. I booked it over to the back of the car and jumped inside the trunk. Thank God I had a big Ford Expedition, so the bear was not able to open it. For another half an hour though, the bear ran the car trying to get at me in a wild frenzy. The police showed up and the siren scared the bear off into the woods again. That was the most terrifying experience of my entire life. This happened my senior year of college, Christmas break 2006. I worked for a professor that asked me to house/dog sit for him while he was out of town to see the bowl game we were in. He was gone for about 3 days and had a huge piece of land in the middle of nowhere. I invited my girlfriend at the time to come with me. He had horses, fishing, a gator, etc. So the first 2 nights went down with no incident, but on the last night, his little foofy dog started having a fit. She kept barking at the back door all of a sudden. At first, we just blew it off, but decided to lock the dog inside in case there was a coyote out there or something. After a while, we started to get a little creeped out though. I kept saying it was probably just an animal and we'd be perfectly fine. My girlfriend wanted to go investigate and see what was out there. I thought it was a bad idea, but what can I say? She went outside and said she'd seen a glimpse of something small and gray, but it ran off. Alright, so just an animal. No worries. By this time, we were both really spooked though. At this moment, the dog started barking at the window on the other side of the house. We were still trying to ignore it, but we were starting to get a little bit worried. We decided to get into bed together. There was an awkward, fearful silence, and then I began to hear it. There was what sounded like a young woman singing a soft, eerie lullaby outside. I didn't say anything, hoping my mind was just playing tricks on me. And that's when my girlfriend turned over to me. "Let's get the fuck out of here." "Why?" I asked. "You didn't hear that girl singing?" "Okay, yeah, let's get out of here." Sure enough, we left right away. I even called someone to talk to me while we walked out to my car. The next morning, we went back to clean up the house and such, but we didn't find any signs of anyone having been outside. The most scared I've ever been, really. Years ago, around Halloween, my family had gathered to watch some scary movies. My mom loved these sorts of things. My dad didn't care very much for them though, so he would get up every few minutes to work on something or other. We had started watching Hitchcock's The Birds, and it was getting pretty late, probably close to midnight I'd say. It was getting cold too. Not just the late October chill of the foothills we lived on, the house was getting real cold. At first, my mom just asked my dad to turn up the thermostat, but after a couple of minutes of the furnace running and the house not warming up, he realized he'd need to go check the furnace downstairs. He grabbed a lighter and headed down there. A minute later, we heard him shouting out for us. "Hey, you gotta come see this!" He said it with something that sounded like part excitement, part nervousness in his voice. We got down there and saw him shining a flashlight into the furnace. Peering in, we noticed the pilot light was indeed out, and then we saw the reason. A dead bird, about the size of my palm or so. It had flown into the furnace from outside and put the flame out, so it was leaking gas into the house. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.